Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. We're looking at draft prospects here lately on the podcast. Corners is where we're going to turn our attention today, Greg. A lot of fun players in this class. Lot of top level talent, but a lot of fun pieces that defenses will be able to add on every day of the upcoming draft this year.
It's a really interesting corner class. As you well know, corners and receivers are normally, not every single year, but normally the two positions of which more players are drafted than any other positions. Because, again, to be cliched but true, for the most part, it's a passing league, and you never have enough corners. We know that. We saw what happened with the Titans last year with injuries. You never have enough corners, quality corners. So there's a bunch of good ones this year, based on the fact everybody's a prospect, but I think there's a bunch of good prospects, and they come in different shapes and sizes. Although what's interesting is it seems corners are getting a little bigger, and that just may be natural selection based on the fact that receivers are getting bigger.
It's kind of like basketball. It's the evolution of the sport, right?
Yeah,
Where the prototypical wide receiver is now Cedric Tillman size dimensions, right? The corners where they've always been matchup advantages or matchup disadvantages with tight ends down the field necessarily. Now the receivers are starting to get to that same size and are creating a lot of problems for the corners, although a lot of longer corners in the NFL trying to find ways to succeed. And certainly at the top of this class, we're going to talk about some dudes that have some pretty unique length. There are obviously a lot of players at this position. Greg, I was just watching, for example, I don't know if you've gotten to him yet, but Deonte Banks at Maryland, who tested really well. I'd completely forgot about him because there's really not a ton of tape, but like just players like that are intriguing that you want to know more about. Those kind of guys are everywhere in this class.
We can start with him because he's one of my favorite guys based on tape. He's 6 feet. He's 197. As you said, he tested really well at the combine. You love when you're in the Big Ten for teams to play Ohio State, because then you get to see him not only against Marvin Harrison, but every other 5-star wide receiver that Ohio State has. And he had some really good matchups against Marvin Harrison in really good reps, where Harrison won a few, Banks won a few. I think he's one of the better outside corner prospects in this draft. He's got size, he's got length, he's got athleticism, he's got man coverage traits, which are absolutely in high demand. You must be able to match up man to man in this league. He's very loose. He's got easy transition fluidity. I like Deonte Banks' tape a lot, and I'm really curious to see where he gets drafted, because I think when all's said and done, most people like bigger than smaller, and he's got gifts, physical and athletic gifts.
Yeah, and obviously this depends on the individual scouting department, but I would say, and certainly when you see the players that teams end up coming out of these drafts with, it does seem like people are trending toward, if you can find guys who can move well with length, obviously that's what you want. That was kind of the logic behind Caleb Farley down here with a much smaller sample size and certainly his future in Tennessee up in the air, which should not preclude them, by the way, for taking a corner in this year's draft, and certainly that would fit Mike Vrabel's MO very, very much. But from Banks to, and I don't know how you view these guys, Greg, or if there's ever like and it probably varies from class to class and based on position, but Christian Gonzalez is a player who I hear talked about as potentially the best corner in this draft. But guys like Keely Ringo and, on down the line, I know we're going to talk about Joey Porter Jr. today as well. Is there one definitive best overall prospect out of this group? Or are you kind of looking at it as they all have things that they can offer at a really high level?
I think the second point is fair, but I would say if I had to pick one that I would say, hey, he's my number one corner prospect, it would be Christian Gonzalez.
Yeah.
Gonzalez is long. He's athletic. His measurables are phenomenal. He ran a 4.38. I think that he's your classic so-called boundary corner in the NFL. The corner that lines up versus the single receiver to the short side of the field. That boundary X receiver position is so critical in today's NFL. That guy has to be able to win one-on-one. You need a corner who can match up to that receiver. Gonzalez has all the traits that you want. I mentioned some of those traits with Banks a moment ago, Buck, but I think, when you look at Gonzalez, he just is better at those traits. He's got size, length, speed, fluidity, competitiveness. I, as you said, normally I don't make lists, and it's not a matter of lists, but I thought when I was, and I haven't seen every corner, obviously, and I'm not going to. I just don't have that kind of time as a one-man scouting service, but I'll see the top 20, give or take, and yeah, he would be number one on my list. It would not surprise me if he came off the board in the top 10 of the first round.
It does seem like it's trending that way. And as you mentioned, teams can never have enough corners. I think the thing that Greg, and obviously I'm not a defensive backs coach, but when I watch him a little bit, as you mentioned, all the traits, there may be a tendency from time to time. Do you notice that his technique will sometimes break down in certain circumstances?
I
You
would,
could say that of any player, but I think that I
yeah.
noticed that a little bit with Gonzalez.
I mean, I would say, look, what I do with my sheets: strengths, weaknesses, transition. No player comes into this league, or I can think of very few I've done over the years where I've not had a weakness, not had bullet points in my weaknesses section.
Right.
So, I said at times in press man, he got back on his heels, negatively impacting his balance, and then he would reach to compensate. Some routes in which he lost contact with the receiver at the top of the route stem and then had to recover. So there are, and I think he needs to win more at the moment of truth when the ball and the receiver meet. There were too many plays he had outstanding coverage and did not play the ball very well. So are those things he needs to improve on? Absolutely. But as I said, that's not a knock on what the player could be. Because as I said, no player comes into the league as a finished product and a perfect player. There are not transcendent players that come in every year. There's very, very few of those, despite what people say. Oh, he's generational. He's this, he's that. These guys are all prospects that haven't played at the highest level of football yet. So while I think he's the best corner prospect, the key word there is prospect.
Yes, that's exactly right. That I think can be very easy to lose for people who are consuming this stuff at this time of year, but it does matter more than anything when you're considering not just the skill set and the traits that the player shows on tape, but also how you're projecting them within your defense in this case. From one boundary corner to another, Greg, Keely Ringo, it's not like Georgia's ever got a shortage of defensive talent, but this guy
No.
has obvious elite size and strength for an outside corner. Physicality, particularly on press release. I mean, he looks every bit the part of what you expect from that Georgia defense, and is probably right there with Gonzalez, although Gonzalez might have a little higher level athleticism, it seems.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. Gonzalez came out of Arizona. He was a big time 5-star recruit. He was the number one corner prospect in the nation and a top 20 recruit overall. So obviously, Georgia's tentacles go far and wide when they look for players. And Ringo's 6'2", 207. So he is a bigger man, and not only in height, but just in the way he's built. He's a stronger built guy. So he's got great size. He's very athletic. He ran a 4.36 buck, but he doesn't necessarily play like that all the time. I would say that unlike Gonzalez, who's really smooth and fluid. In fact, in my positive traits part for Gonzalez, I said smooth as silk. Ringo is a little straight line linear in his movement, a little tight hipped, because he's so powerfully built.
Yeah.
So I think he's a really good prospect, but he's a different kind of player. Now, I think he'd prefer to play press man. I think he's more comfortable playing press coverage, both what we call mirror match, where you don't put your hands on the receiver, and physical press, where you do disrupt the receiver off the line with your hands and your arms. I think he probably feels more comfortable playing that because, when you're tight hipped and you're playing off, the transition and the change of direction, reacting to deceive the receiver's routes is a little harder because you're just not as smooth. You get a little segmented in your change of direction. So therefore, to me, he's not quite the same level of prospect, even though he's still a very good prospect.
When you watch Ringo on film, was there a game that particularly that as we've talked about before, Greg, you see a game or a couple of snaps of a prospect, you want to keep watching games because they've got you intrigued. Was there that game or that kind of moment for you when you were watching Ringo?
No, because to be honest with you, with Georgia, because there's so many players on defense, I think I've watched 9 games. So it's not like I just watched 1 or 2. I think I watched 9 full games with the coaching tape, every single snap. So there's not one game or one play. Yeah, what probably stands out to me more, by the way, is watching Ringo from a year ago in the championship game when they played Alabama, because he had a lot of snaps against Jamison Williams, and Jamison Williams, he beat him over the top a couple of times. So Ringo is, he's not a sudden twitchy guy because of the way he's built. So he's a little more, size and physicality probably define him more than speed, despite his 4.36. Because as I said, he doesn't necessarily play like that.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, play strength, play speed. We talk about, coaches talk about it all the time. That's what matters practically. I mean, you're at the combine to figure out what kind of athlete you're drafting. And then, obviously the tape is how you.
Yeah. And then, I mean, look, sometimes the tape and the measurables match exactly. Sometimes they're a little different, and that's not a big deal. Sometimes they're meaningfully different. And then you have to decide, I've had these conversations with GMs and former GMs. You got to be real careful about letting measurables supersede what you see a guy do on tape.
Greg, I'm officially at the age where players who I remember watching, their sons are now in the league, and I hate it. One such player is Joey Porter Jr. And there's been a couple of these, especially in baseball. It feels like a lot of baseball players' kids are in the league right now as we sit here taping this on
opening day today, Buck. Opening day today.
I know the Braves fans are fired up. They got a pretty good lead on the Nats right now. I got it on in the studio. You have a baseball team in particular, Greg? You a Phillies fan?
I've become one just because I live here, and obviously last year was a lot of fun.
Sure.
It was hard not to root for the Phils last year, particularly living in this area. But I grew up, because I grew up in Queens in New York, I grew up a big Mets fan. That stopped years ago. I follow baseball. I look at the box scores every day, but I'm not necessarily a passionate fan of one team at this point in my life.
Well, Mets fans going through it after the World Baseball Classic, a couple injuries there. But this is not a baseball podcast.
No. But anyway, Joey Porter. Joey
yes.
Porter is a little freakish well, first of all, he's 6'2.5", which is great size.
Giant.
But he's got, his arm length is 34 inches, Buck, which is like an offensive lineman. I mean, it's ridiculous. So, to me, Porter, he's a press corner. He wants to play that way. He's your boundary your boundary corner. You want to line him up, let him get his hands on receivers. He's physical. The arm length, as we said, is really ridiculous. One of the biggest issues he's had is that he tends to be handsy and grabby early in the route and through the route. You can't do that in the NFL. That is an issue for a lot of corners when they come out of college, because in college you're allowed to do that. Look, in college, I see guys playing press and 12 yards down the field, they just drive guys out of bounds. We know you can't do that in the NFL. So, that's just something they have to learn. But he's tough, he's competitive, he's physical, he reroutes receivers. Play strength is one of his best traits. So he's a really interesting prospect. People will point to his ball production, which is not there, by the way, but he didn't get thrown at very much. Sometimes when you watch corners and safeties, you got to go through a lot of games and you say, gee, I hope kind of something happens.
Right.
Otherwise you're just watching traits, which you have to see anyway, but you'd like to see, like for instance, when I watched Deonte Banks against Ohio State, there were numerous throws where he was matched up on Harrison, and you got a real feel for the ball being thrown against a guy who's going to be a top 10 pick next year, Harrison, versus Deonte Banks. So you got to feel for it. With Porter, sometimes I'd go through a whole game and it's like, okay, what happened?
Somebody throw at him.
Other than, hey, this guy's a good press man corner and he looks good, and but sometimes with Porter it was hard to get a real feel, but he's got traits for sure.
Well, and it's just at that length, Greg, is so insane. You watch him out there, and he's like a pterodactyl on the field. Like you almost can't blame quarterbacks for not throwing in his direction, because the radius that he can cover with a wingspan like that, it makes it a pretty difficult. Your ball placement has to be spot on.
Yeah, and those 34-inch arms. There's another corner in this year's draft with the same 34-inch arms, and that's Julius Brents out of Kansas State. Now he's not going to be a first-round pick, I don't believe, but that's ridiculous for a corner, 34-inch arms.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously a lot more corners in this class, and a lot of guys who are going to go. Is Banks a first round pick at this point, Greg, or do you think he's more a day two projection?
I mean, I can only tell you, Buck, what I think.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's
That's
all
the
I
only
can
reason I
say.
ask. You're the
Yeah,
only person I got to ask, Greg.
yeah. To me, he is. To me,
Okay.
But again, I'm sitting in my office watching tape. I
Sure.
don't know Deontay Banks. Let's assume all good things. Okay, no red flags, no issues. If that's the case, to me, Deontay Banks is a first round corner. Based on tape study and his attributes.
I don't know why I get the feeling that the Titans are. I mean, I know the Titans are going to be in the cornerback market this time around, even with.
Well, if they had to start the season today, who would be their outside corners? Fulton would be one, correct?
And McCreary would be the other.
And again, I don't want to. I'm not saying I'm smarter than the Titans coaches, but to me, McCreary is a slot corner. To me, doesn't make me right, but that's the way I see him.
Well, and they by the way, they took a little time to figure that out with Christian Fulton. They started him initially on the inside and then eventually moved him outside at a necessity, and it seemed like that was a much better fit for his skill set. So we'll see how creative Tennessee gets with their secondary this year. Greg, one more question for you out the door, just because it's swirling around at owners meetings concluding this week. Right now, are you surprised that teams are not more in on the idea of trading for Lamar Jackson at this point?
Well, I would guess that there's a lot more going on there than just
Certainly.
Yeah, so that's a hard question to answer. No one's going to sit here and say Lamar Jackson's not a great dynamic player. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, well, they don't want him because he's not any good. That's silly. Of course, he's a great player and he's an explosive player and he's a game changer and an impactful player. We know. So there's more going on here, Buck, that you and I clearly don't know about. So it becomes very hard to discuss, why teams aren't interested. But there's clearly something going on that is probably goes beyond just his play on the field.
Yeah,
and,
it has to be.
Right. And maybe we'll find that out. Maybe all that'll get leaked at some point, or maybe we won't find it out and we'll not know. But it goes beyond on the field. Now, the only thing I would say about on the field is when he came, people can talk about what he did in college all day long with Bobby Petrino and he ran a pro offense. It's yes and no. Without going into every detail of the offense, that's a yes and no. It's not a straight line answer. But I can tell you for a fact, because I knew someone on the staff when he was in his first couple of years in the league in Baltimore, that they structured an offense specifically for him. And it's a little different than your quote unquote conventional NFL offense. And obviously he excelled in it because it really played to the fact that there was no one in the league with his dynamic traits as a runner. And he's a good passer. I don't know if we'd say he's a great passer, but he's a good passer.
Yeah.
But they built an offense specifically for him. So the question is, and I'm just talking from a football perspective, this may have nothing to do with why he's not been traded for, or it may have everything to do. Who knows? But the point I'm trying to make is, do teams feel that you would have to do that if he was your quarterback? And if teams feel they would have to do that, that's a little more complicated than people might think. So, that's like starting over now, trying to build an offense. And again, I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just postulating it.
No, and I wanted to ask you that question, Greg, because I knew you'd give me a very football on-field specific answer. I'm just looking for any answers anywhere that I can get, because this whole thing was very confusing to me. But
and because and again, I bet that 95% of it has to do with things you and I have no idea about.
Yeah, that seems to be the state of things right now with a very intriguing young player, former MVP of the league. Greg, appreciate the time as always. Look forward to getting into some more prospect talk with you as we start to inch closer, less than a month away from the NFL draft. And then we can start to dive into how these players fit in their landing spots, and always enjoy the conversation. Thanks for hanging out, buddy.
Buck, always appreciate it, my friend.